Hi everyone, and welcome to the annual general meeting of the Heritage Trust of Nova Scotia. My name is David Jones, and I'm an archaeologist and historian from Downtown Dartmouth. Today's presentation is on the Downtown Dartmouth Heritage Conservation District. This is a pre-recorded presentation so we can avoid any problems with Zoom. I'll be available for live questions after the pre-recorded presentation. So to tell you a little bit more about myself, I grew up in downtown Dartmouth on Elliott Street by Sullivan's Pond. I have a Bachelor of Arts from St. Mary's University, a double major in anthropology and history. I'm currently a student at Mount St. Vincent University in my second and final year of the secondary program for a Bachelor of Education. My practicum placement is at Island View, the new high school in Eastern Passage, where I teach Law 12 and next term Canadian History 11. Every week you can listen to me on The Rick Howe Show on News 95.7, where I speak about Dartmouth, Halifax, and Nova Scotian history, archaeology, and current events. I enjoy that very much, and it's a great opportunity. I have a long legacy of being involved in Dartmouth community and history, and that goes back to John Martin, my great-great-uncle, who was the town historian of Dartmouth and a teacher and a principal. So I like to follow in his footsteps, and in my presentation I've included a picture of him holding the Story of Dartmouth, the book that summarizes Dartmouth history from even before 1750 with Mi'kmaq history up until the 1920s, which was quite recent memory when he wrote the book in the 1950s. So, to ground us in what a Heritage Conservation District is, there's a recent HRM document from August that outlines the idea of a Heritage Conservation District. So, to quote the document, a Heritage Conservation District is a defined area of historic or architectural value that is protected by regulations governing such things as demolition, exterior alteration, and new development. Incentives may apply within the district to encourage private architectural conservation, and municipal programs can enhance public amenities. A conservation plan and bylaw may be adopted alongside other development control mechanisms, such as municipal planning strategy and land use bylaw amendments. Next to this definition, I've included a picture of two historic properties in downtown Dartmouth, 98 and 100 King Street. John Martin believes that 98 King Street dates back to 1818, and that was owned by Thomas Davies, who was active in downtown Dartmouth at that time. This area is also thought to be the site of one of the original Dartmouth blockhouses built in the 1750s. This is a very important part of downtown Dartmouth, and I would hope that a Heritage Conservation District could protect properties like these ones that I've illustrated in the presentation. So, as you may be familiar with, there are already a few Heritage Conservation Districts in HRM, including Schmidtville and the Old South suburb. Now, moving forward, it was a goal of the municipality to create far more Heritage Conservation Districts. And the next three that have been prioritized are Downtown Dartmouth, the Old North suburb, and Creighton's Field. Downtown Dartmouth scored the highest on a set of various criteria that include a high concentration of registered heritage properties already, rare examples of historic architecture, in our case, let's say the Quaker House from 1786 on Ochterlony Street, the oldest known surviving building in Dartmouth. Another criteria is areas that are experiencing a high rate of change based on permit activity from development over the past 5 years. And finally, areas that are threatened by large-scale redevelopment because of current land use designations. So Dartmouth scored very high on this, and that's why we're dealing with this today. So to give you more stats about the Downtown Dartmouth Heritage Conservation District that has been proposed and is being worked on right now, it covers a total of 243,634 square meters. There are currently 165 properties in the defined area. There are 26 registered heritage properties, and it's hoped that that number will quickly expand. The average date of those registered heritage properties is 1866. That's the oldest average of all the heritage districts, the new ones that were considered. And the number of permits issued in the area from 2016 to 2020 in that roughly 5-year range is 83. So, for the remainder of my presentation, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the history of the downtown Dartmouth area. So we're going to start with the Mi'kmaq history. And this picture comes from the photo collection of the Dartmouth Heritage Museum. And this comes from 1950. This was taken on Natal Day in 1950 in August, and that was celebrating the bicentennial of Dartmouth, going from 1950 back to 1750. So this photo is quite significant. This photo includes Mi'kmaq people who are on a float being driven through downtown Dartmouth to show people the pre-European history of the region. Now, what's very significant is the chief who is standing at the front of the truck. His name is Chief Stephen Knockwood from Shubenacadie. If you look very closely in this picture, he's wearing a silver armlet from the early 1800s that denotes the chief of the Shubenacadie district, the mainland Grand Council of Nova Scotia. So this was passed through the Knockwood family and is currently in the safekeeping of Ron Knockwood, who's the Grand Chief of the mainland district of the Grand Council. This float also shows a wigwam. Wigwams were Mi'kmaq dwellings that would have been seen all throughout Dartmouth for not just hundreds, but thousands of years. The Mi'kmaq people relied heavily for not just transportation, but for their lifeway, for a place to live, on the Shubenacadie River system, which runs from the Minas Basin on the Truro side of Nova Scotia down throughout the lakes, including Grand Lake and the Dartmouth Lakes, to downtown Dartmouth, to Dartmouth Cove. So the Mi'kmaq people would have lived all along the Dartmouth waterfront, along the Dartmouth Lakes, on ridges and knolls throughout Dartmouth, and all up through the Shubie system. Now, when we talked about the bicentennial of Dartmouth, that goes back to 1750. So in 1749, the year that Halifax was founded, there was a sawmill and a blockhouse built at Dartmouth Point on Dartmouth Cove by Ezekiel Gilman. He was a major from New England. He had fought in Louisbourg. He received his rank of major in recognition of developing a system to float or drag cannons through the swamps approaching Louisbourg that helped the British bombard the fortress. He knew how to do this from his expertise in the sawmilling and the logging industry down in New Hampshire. That was his family business. So he was given the rank of major, and he was given land at Dartmouth Point, at Dartmouth Cove. So he built a sawmill and a small fortified blockhouse, and then the community started to develop a year later in 1750, where a grid system was laid down on the downtown Dartmouth that we know and love today. That was surveyed by Charles Morris, the first provincial surveyor of Nova Scotia. Now, jumping ahead from the 1750s to 1785, the Nantucket Quaker whalers from New England came to Dartmouth, Nova Scotia in 1785 to establish a whaling fleet. Several houses, about 12, were built for the Quakers, and they were scattered throughout a newly laid town plot that was superimposed over the 1750 plot in a slightly different configuration. Town blocks were 220 feet by 220 feet, and one lot granted to a Quaker whaler and his family would have been 60 feet by 120 feet. And as Dr. John Martin outlines in the story of Dartmouth, streets were widened from 55 feet to 60 feet. Now, if you go on a socially distanced walk on Ochterlony Street, you'll see that there's a little lane that used to be called Chapel Lane that runs roughly between where Edward Street and Prince Street are today in downtown Dartmouth. It used to be known as one street, Prince Edward Street, but that lane is much smaller, a little bit smaller at least, and John Martin says that's a relic of the old 1750 town plot of Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Now, this presentation, sadly, doesn't just talk about the potential for protecting our heritage, it talks about heritage that's already been lost. So here I have several slides that show Quaker built or Quaker related houses that have been destroyed. Now, at the very bottom of this image, we have a property that used to be on 4 Commercial Street, which today would be in the Alderney Drive area. That was a Quaker built house that was destroyed for developments that would become City Hall and now in the area of Alderney Gate or Alderney Landing. To the right of the slide, we have 55 King Street, which today is the parking lot across from the Dartmouth Senior Service Center. That also was a Quaker built house. And then finally, our last photo in the top left corner, that shows one building that still survives as 63 King Street that has been lovingly restored and protected. That's a registered heritage property, but the other buildings in the shot, there are several restaurants in that area, and many of you, if you're from Dartmouth, would remember the Marinova Hotel was built on top of that site. So, I want to also talk about the important Black history of downtown Dartmouth. So if you go on Victoria Road today, which is the eastern extent of the proposed Downtown Dartmouth Heritage Conservation District, you will see the Victoria Road United Baptist Church across from Christ Church Cemetery. This is a very significant building because in 1905 it became the new home for a Black Baptist congregation that used to be located between Lake Bannock and Lake Micmac, further away from downtown Dartmouth. Now, this was a community where they had a church from the 1840s, and that was a Black community pushed to the margins of downtown Dartmouth, and they suffered problems very similar to Africville in that the services to the white community stopped right when the Black community started at the end of Creighton Avenue. In 1894, the road that we now know as Creighton Avenue, it used to be called Colored Meeting House Road. In 1894, that name was changed to Creighton Avenue. But in 1905, Christ Church donated their old Sunday school building, which dates back to the 1850s, to this congregation, and they relocated on Victoria Road, and that building survives today as a thriving place of worship and a registered heritage property just on the edge of the proposed Heritage Conservation District in downtown Dartmouth. Now, something so important to commemorating our built heritage is having a civic museum, a place for residents of HRM to come and gather to celebrate their heritage, their history, their archaeology, and their culture. But right now, HRM is lacking a civic museum. Although there is a Dartmouth Heritage Museum, it's divided into 2 separate physical buildings, both registered heritage properties in Dartmouth. Evergreen House, the home of Helen Creighton, and Quaker House, which is the oldest surviving building in downtown Dartmouth. But those 2 complexes don't tell the history of all of HRM, so it's been widely thought that we should have a building to consolidate all the different stories of our very vast municipality. Now, it would make a lot of sense to have that on the Dartmouth side because of the collection that survives in Dartmouth. It's stored in Burnside, and that's the collection of the former Dartmouth Heritage Museum in the city of Dartmouth. That could be housed on the Dartmouth waterfront, so people could travel from the Nova Scotian capital, Halifax, across the ferry, which has been running since 1752, over to downtown Dartmouth and learn about the history. And even though the collection was Dartmouth-based and focused, it tells stories that can relate to people, places, and things all throughout our beautiful region. Now, something that could go hand in hand with a downtown Dartmouth Heritage Conservation District would be a HRM Archaeological Management Plan. In this slide, I've included a picture of a seemingly empty parking lot in downtown Dartmouth on Ochterlony Street, but not many people know that this used to be the location of St. Peter's Church Hall before St. Peter's Church moved to its various configurations on Maple Street on the edge of downtown Dartmouth by Sullivan's Pond. Before this was the location of the church hall, it was the location of the first St. Peter's Cemetery. The first one was here on Ochterlony Street. The second was on Geary Street, close to Alderney Landing. And the next and final St. Peter's Cemetery is off of Victoria Road, just above Christ Church Cemetery. Now, John Martin records in a history of St. Peter's Church that he wrote that several bodies were exhumed when the church hall was being constructed in the late 1800s. We have no idea of knowing how many bodies could remain in this parking lot, and that's a really important reason that we should have an archaeological management plan. Now, archaeological management plans are very popular in Ontario and Quebec and in other cities and municipalities throughout Canada, but there isn't one in Halifax, and we sure have tried to have one for decades. Heritage advocates like myself, although I'm slightly new to the game, Dr. Jonathan Fowler, Dr. Paul Erickson, Rob Ferguson, a retired Parks Canada archaeologist, have pressed the city. They've even developed one to try to have one of these plans. These plans would already outline through mapping and heritage research where the high potential areas for archaeology are. So it would make it very easy for historians, for city planners, and for developers and interested community members to know what the heck is underneath the ground in our beautiful areas. So, in my opinion, a heritage conservation district shouldn't just be about our beautiful and rich built heritage. It should also entail what's underneath the ground, because we have thousands of years of history that are all throughout downtown Dartmouth and Halifax and the municipality and the province in more general terms. To give you more examples of this buried history, if any of you are familiar with St. James Church at the corner of Prince Albert Road and Portland Street in downtown Dartmouth, St. James was built in the early 1870s, but when it was constructed, many human remains were found, and this is a trend that has continued throughout time. In the 1840s, in a local newspaper article, it was recorded that a house was being built on that knoll in downtown Dartmouth, and they found human remains. And that 1840 article says that human remains had been found for a long time before any time people were working in that area. They found them again in 1870s. In 1894, when they were building the church manse for St. James, they also found human remains, and again in the 1950s when they were building the church hall. So essentially, anytime anyone has ever dug on that little hill in downtown Dartmouth, they've encountered skeletons. And Harry Peers, who's famous for his role as the provincial curator of the Nova Scotia Museum and for his diligent research and collecting, he went to that site when they were building the church manse in 1894, and he found several skeletons and also a groundstone hammer belonging to the Mi'kmaq people on that site. So that's rich in history and something to consider whenever we're digging a hole in downtown Dartmouth. So, as my grandmother Marie Jones taught me from a very early age, you can change the world with a phone call. But I like to take a modern twist on that, and you can make change happen by sending out a tweet or an email. So if you're really interested in the Downtown Dartmouth Heritage Conservation District, you should contact Mayor Mike Savage to ask how the project is going, and you can also easily email clerks@halifax.ca to contact all of the HRM Regional Council members. That's a very easy way to get your opinions and your questions out. You should also talk to Aaron Murnahan, who's the Principal Planner for Heritage for HRM. I've also included his email in this slide. And finally, you can contact the HRM Heritage Advisory Committee. I've also included that contact info. I'm very glad that people are interested in downtown Dartmouth, in our heritage, in our history, in our archaeology, in our stories, and our culture. And I think this is a great opportunity to protect and tell those stories and look after, properly manage any development that's going to happen from now on in. Thank you so much for attending this virtual and pre-recorded session. I really appreciate the help that I've received from the Heritage Trust. It's a great opportunity. But now, as you know, I love to talk, and let's open up the floor for live questions. So if you give us a second, we'll adjust things so that I'll come on live. You'll see I'm wearing a different shirt, and we can talk about downtown Dartmouth, the Heritage Conservation District, and maybe we can look at a few more images and maps. So thank you very much for this experience.